Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Patrick Tucker, Science and Technology Editor of Defense One. Thanks for joining us for the State of the Army. It's the final installment of our three-part State of Defense video series. It's also part of our larger State of Defense Special Report, which looks at the challenges and the opportunities shaping the year ahead. Today, we turn our focus to the U.S. Army. We'll be talking first with the Army's Chief of Staff, General Randy George. But before we begin, a few quick reminders. Below the video player, you'll find the chat box. You can use it to submit questions for our speakers, talk with fellow attendees, and request technical assistance. This event is being recorded and will be available on demand shortly, allowing you to revisit insights and share them with colleagues. Now, here's General George. Hi, I'm Patrick Tucker, Science and Technology Editor at Defense One, sitting here with General Randy George, Chief of Staff of the United States Army. Thank you so much, General, for sitting with me today.
Thanks, Pat.
Yeah. This is a pretty exciting time for the United States Army in a lot of different ways, particularly in a lot of the things that I like to talk about, which is the democratization of technology. Great big capabilities that used to be in the hands of a few that took forever to create, moving down, distributing across much larger groups. And you at the United States Army have a really great window into that right now in terms of what it means for you and transforming the future force of the United States Army into something that is both better matched to peer adversaries, great big high-tech entities, China, Russia, and of course everyone that associates with them, but also that moves at the speed of information technology, which moves much faster than a lot of people appreciated even a few years ago. So first, as part of this transformational campaign, you recently went out to Germany. Tell us a little bit about this and who you talked with there.
I think you did a great job kind of explaining exactly what's happening in our world right now. I mean, we're seeing commercial tech move faster than it has, and I think that that's really the difference of what we're seeing. So in the Army, we like to say they're only lessons observed, they're not lessons learned until we actually change how we train and operate, change how we organize, and then change how we buy things. And that is the idea behind transforming in contact. The other thing that we know is that we're going to get from the bottom up. There's no one better at innovating than our soldiers. You put developers out there with our soldiers on the ground and testers, and we're going to actually test what we're doing out there in combat like conditions. Then we're really going to find out what we need inside of our formation. So that's what I was over there in Germany this last week to look at. It was our third Transforming in Contact Brigade that we actually went over and observed. It was we've done one stateside, we did one in the Pacific. This one was over in Germany. Not surprising, in February. It was cold, icy. The terrain was very different, and so we learned a lot of lessons about battery technology as an example, and the challenges with cold weather. We learned, and that had a lot of impact with the drones that we were flying. We learned a lot of lessons again on our network. So we're rolling all of those up, and again we had developers that were on the ground, and we had people that owned those products that can take those lessons back immediately. And I think that that's the most exciting thing, is that we're seeing changes in weeks and months rather than waiting years to advance.
Yeah, and so that, I think, in many ways shows a potential future change in a couple of sort of big institutional things. There are legacy systems that, and different things that Army requires to distribute out across the entire force, great big uniform thing. Yeah. And of course everyone also receives roughly sort of the same training. And what you're talking about, it's not just acquisition modernization, it's not just changes in training and doctrine command across the entire force. You're talking battalion by battalion. These fighting entities develop in many ways their own personality, their own needs. They're going to be equipped differently depending on the feedback that they give you, how you begin to interact with them. And that really challenges the idea of uniformity among the Army. So talk a little bit about that. How do you envision, for instance, a piece of technology changing from battalion to battalion as soldiers experience it, experiment with it, and give you feedback?
Yeah, well, first is, what we're going to buy for our formations. They are going to be a little bit different. And, a good example is we got units that operate up in the Arctic. You need, different kit when you're going to operate up in the Arctic. Drones work differently up there. The network works differently up there. Same thing in the Pacific. So I think we can do that. We've been all about, for drones as an example, the first drones that we gave to the units that were in 2nd Brigade 101st, were different than the ones that this unit that in Germany just got 310 Mountain. They were, the drones were, had longer range. They were cheaper, more hardened, more effective. This last brigade that we had over 200 drones inside the formation. So we're, exploring how we're organized to make sure that we can, maximize these capabilities. But environment is a big part of it, as you know. I mean, even where different things do different things. What we're getting after this third one is we are going to make some decisions on how the Army is organized in our brigade combat teams. So we've had these 3 experiments in 3 different areas. Next month they're going to come back to me and Secretary of the Army with here's the new force design update and here's how we want to change the formation. And so we will look at that and we will broadly have the same formations, but we will have some flexibility based on what environments they go to, which I think is different.
Yeah. And you're also able to keep pace with the speed of information technology. So instead of a great big program that's pushed out and then takes years to update, what you're describing is adaptation that's happening really all the time that continues to roll.
Yeah.
So in many ways, as you plan for the future, you can't plan for a specific sort of time. You have to plan for a pace of continuous change through 2030. So the Army of 2030 is kind of today.
Yeah. Well, we don't actually use, I'm not a fan of Army 2030. I'm, like, hey, we got to, we talk about continuous transformation because we need to get better, month to month and year to year and be very, very focused in that respect. And it's not just the equipment. On the equipment side, before I go to people, we are looking to do agile funding and we're working with Congress on, how we would do that. What we don't want to do is buy a program. We don't want to pick a drone and fly that same drone for the next 30 years. I mean, we did that. We canceled a program about a year ago this time where we actually said, hey, this was a good drone several years ago, but we don't want to be locked into that. So we want to buy capabilities. We want to do that with UAS. We want to do that with counter UAS. We want to do that with EW, and then update our formations and be able to do that.
Yeah.
The other aspect is, and what we're getting through this experimentation is and exercises is that we're actually figuring out how we're organized, what kind of skills we need our people to have. Our NCOs are really helping to lead us through this. Do we need a master drone operator at the company level? Do we need a tech integrator at the battalion level? So we're figuring that out as we go as well.
Yeah. But it also sounds like in order to meet expectations on budget and develop all this stuff, you have to, in many ways, consider giving something else up. Legacy systems, what are you thinking there in terms of what might be at risk and be less relevant for the environment that you're thinking about for the future?
Well, I gave you a couple of examples of things. We did cancel the Shadow was one that we canceled. Raven, that were drones that were good in their day, but they were not going to be war-winning capabilities in the future. We made a decision to cancel future attack reconnaissance aircraft and focus that funding on drones, loitering munitions, machines that can do a lot of that and can do it, that we could get inside our formation much quicker and would be much, I think much more capable. We're going to review everything across the Army, and we're in the process of doing that. And we have to look at what is going to be a war-winning capability and look forward. I think everybody does that in their own personal budget, where they make tough choices about what isn't, getting the best return on investment, and that's what we're looking at.
Yeah.
We've also done stuff inside of our formations where we're getting rid of excess inside of our formation. So we're trying to reduce, obviously, to be more mobile on the battlefield, you need to take, I think the leaner you are to travel. I'll give you one example that the network is foundational to everything that we do. We are, and we'll see this out of Project Convergence here next month. But where we typically had big satellite dishes, server stacks, and all kinds of extra vehicles, we're now talking about a commander that's on the field and his staff that is basically operating off of tablets and software-defined radios and very simple kit, which will make us much more mobile, much more lower signature. We're seeing that in what we're doing in transforming in contact, and then it's going to reduce the costs that we have inside of our formation, so that we can put that money towards other war-winning capabilities that we need.
Yeah. So let's take that and compare it to what we see from peer threats, China and Russia. They have command economies. They don't have the same sort of bureaucratic obstacles to affect transformational change. Watching, of course, the Ukrainian battlefield and knowing how much of the Ukrainian military is modeled after the strong NCO Corps of the United States Army, the adversaries don't necessarily have the same NCO Corps, and that's sort of important. But when you look at China and Russia, how does what you say correspond to what you're seeing from them? What are you thinking about when you look at how, their own modernization and change programs?
So, first, I will tell you that I tell everybody what is our secret sauce is our leaders, our junior leaders, specifically our NCO Corps, and then, we'll have you out to one of those formations. You can watch that, see that, and just how innovative they are. We have soldiers that are out there that are making apps that can help with our air assault operations. They're 3D printing. They're doing all kinds. They're helping us make drones, and doing things. But beyond just the tactical level, part of what we're looking at now with expanding transformation and contact is actually moving to the operational level. And I think everybody has seen the effectiveness of land-based, long-range fires and what that can do inside of our formations. So we'll be experimenting with our multi-domain task forces, and we're standing up 5 of those. And how we change on the battlefield with that, how we change with integrated air and missile defense, which is critical, and then also looking operationally at counter UAS and how we're going to infuse that into our formations as well.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that, because missile defense and long-range fires, the multi-domain task force teams, these are the big elements that are most relevant to the Army challenge, particularly in the Indo-PACOM AOR, where you have distributed forces that have to be in a lot of different places. And as I know from my coverage, you also have to have partner militaries, and those relationships are hugely important. That's a huge asset the U.S. military has that others don't necessarily have. So can you talk a little bit about the challenge of, there's the European battlefield, and then there is the Indo-PACOM battlefield. We talked about bottom-up innovation, how important that is, but as you look to that challenge, keeping an adversary deterred from escalating, how do you envision the Army's role amongst the other services, as it is its own joint force, but it's also part of a broader joint force?
Well, we always talk about that there's really no such thing as maritime theater, air theater. They're all joint theaters. Everybody lives on land. We're going to be, an integral part. And again, my view, an asymmetric advantage. A lot of the militaries in the Pacific are Army forces, and we've got great relationships with them. And I think what we're doing to transform will help inform them as well. And again, getting after cost curve, but land-based long-range fires and how critical those can be to the joint force, how critical integrated air and missile defense is going to be to the force. We talked about counter UAS. Really, it's just layered protection that we're going to need. We're relooking how we do logistics. There's a lot that automation can do to enhance what we're doing for logistics. Automated systems that can deliver things around the world, but specifically in the Pacific. And, what do we need to do to be specifically tailored for that region? And that's exactly what we're focused on. So it's why 25th Infantry Division is one of our, is one of the first divisions that we're doing. A lot of these operational level changes all the way up to U.S. Army Pacific. So it will touch every warfighting function that we have out there. Yeah.
And I think that on logistics, one of the more interesting lessons from Ukraine is both that very close to the line, there's a lot of things that can happen innovation-wise. You see folks out there 3D printing parts, replacement parts for howitzers and things in the mud. But one of the other lessons is, of course, that you need to have that long tail. You need to have that long supply tail. And those things are a little bit in conflict, especially as you're talking about buying things in potentially very small numbers, quickly changing those numbers depending on different battalion needs. How do you see that relationship, both the need to quickly create supplies at the front, but also make sure that long tail behind them is there to continue to provide the support that they need, so that that sustained fight can keep going?
Yeah, so one of the things that we're looking at is to make sure at the tactical level that we're reducing, the requirements that we would have. So a good example is the new vehicle that we put out, the ISV Heavy is what we called it. It was a diesel hybrid electric, could actually operate the brigade command and control node for, more than 2 days completely, silently, when we normally we're dragging around generators. And so I think about that's less fuel consumption, not to mention that you have silent watch, silent approach, all of those things that we're doing. And again, I think by making our formations more mobile and leaner, that is going to help, broadly. The other thing that we're looking at, and you mentioned it, is, what can we do to 3D print parts that are forward? That has gotten cheaper and, less expensive to 3D print parts. We can actually 3D print parts that, typically would cost us quite a bit more, for really pennies. We can do that forward. We can, reduce the supply lines that we have. So if you're reducing the fuel, you're reducing the supply lines that we have, your formations are a little more leaner. I think that all that will help. And then the other thing is that is looking at, at reducing the complexity of our formation, so we just don't have the different, the number of parts and the things that we have inside of our formation. So we're looking at this from every angle. I think TIC, Transforming in Contact 2.0, will help inform that quite a bit.
Yeah, it's fascinating because in many ways you're describing a really fundamental change to the traditional idea of soldiering, where this new thing is much more entrepreneurial, encompasses a lot more potential skills, a lot more room to, as you've said, provide bottom-up feedback, which we don't necessarily associate with militaries, but this is something that's pretty common in small, very high-functioning, successful technology teams, is being able to surface that bottom-up feedback. And that describes, I think, a great incentive for the Army of the future. When you talk to folks today in terms of personnel, housing, things like this, what are the main things you're hearing, and how do you respond to their concerns?
Well, I think, just getting back to the point you just made about getting feedback. So we just finished that rotation. People will give immediate feedback, and typically, rather than sending something out to the test range, waiting a year to make changes, and then eventually getting it to the formation, that's coming back almost immediately back into the system. And that's the process change that we're talking about. What changes do we need to adapt for what environments, and how do we immediately, you change your requirements. that's the other big thing that we're trying to get away from. In the past, typically we had written these, 200 or 300 page documents for requirements, and now we're, describing the problems that we're trying to solve, and we've called it a characterization of need. And what that has allowed is industry and all of these, brilliant minds that are out there, that they can help us figure out how to solve our problems. So, the feedback that I generally get from everybody when I'm out there is, they want their unit to be a part of this, and they want to go faster. And I think that's one of the big lessons that we're learning. We want to go faster, and I think for us, that's about changing the processes that we've talked about. I think we can go faster and make those changes, and certainly the bigger challenge is probably back here. That's a bigger challenge than it is for our formations. Our soldiers are ready for it, and they're very adaptive.
Yeah, let's get into that while we have a moment or two left, because in terms of bodies that do like talking about and emphasizing the need for accelerated change, but are, if I dare say, pretty poor at displaying it in practice, the United States Congress comes to mind. And you've got a potential challenge there. SASC and the HASC, I love covering them because there's huge bipartisan support for a lot of things, but you also have constituencies. Each one has their little treasure, and they want to provide oversight, but they're not necessarily good at responding. How do you deal with, first of all, in your discussions on the Hill, do you think that now the moment has actually come where they're ready to accommodate transformational change and adjust some of the ways that they've gone about kind of monitoring and providing a lot of requirements and being very requirement focused into something that's much more adaptive and bottom-up led? Do you think that that moment has finally come?
I do, actually. I think I've gotten very positive feedback when I'm on the Hill, talking about what we're doing and what we need to do. They certainly, everybody understands, how fast technology is moving and what we need to do to change. We've been working with them and have gotten really positive feedback on agile funding. So we also, it's very important to us to make sure that that they provide oversight. That's their job. And I think that, we can do that in a way that shows them, how we are transforming, how taxpayers are spending the money and how they're getting value out of it. I think that that's, critically important. So, I think technology will allow us to do that as well, to show them, what we're doing. So I always say that the changes, this is us, and we always like to look at ourselves first. What do we need to do with our own processes? We've gotten after changing, how we're writing requirements. We have to look at how we're, integrating, things in, how long we take to do some of these things. We're looking at what are the financial management regulations that need to change and acquisition regulations, but I think there's a broad consensus that we need to, make these adjustments and kind of move out on it. So, I'm getting positive feedback, and obviously the devil's in the details as far as figuring that out, but I'm optimistic.
Okay. Well, there's a picture right now of the future of the Army. There is no 2030. 2030 is now much more bottom-up feedback, much more change and diversity on the battalion level. And finally, congressional enthusiasm for the ideal of agile funding, moving away from legacy things that are obsolete by the time they hit the battlefield, the ability to make much more frontline, backline, depending on the need and the operator input. That's a huge change. So thank you for giving us a window into that.
Thank you, Pat.
I really appreciate the time. Patrick Tucker, Science Technology Editor for Defense One, General Randy George, Chief of Staff of the United States Army. Thank you so much, sir.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Patrick. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Lauren Williams, Senior Editor at Defense One, and I'm excited to continue our State of the Army discussions with an eye on emerging technology. The Army's modernization push, transformation, and contact is already in motion, but how is it playing out on the ground? Today, I get to talk to Colonel Josh Glonek, commander of the 3rd Brigade, 10th Mountain Division, about how technology is shaping the future of warfare in real time. Colonel, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to kick things off. If you could just tell us a little bit about your mission at 10th Mountain and what you've been up to recently.
Yeah, so the 3rd Brigade, 10th Mountain Division is over here in Europe on a rotational deployment. So for the past 9 months, we have been dispersed along NATO's eastern flank with troops up in the Baltics all the way down to the Black Sea region, where I'm currently located. And over the course of our deployment, we've been taking on the Army's Transformation and Contact mission, which has been an opportunity to rapidly integrate a whole variety of new emerging technologies into our formation and to provide feedback to the Army on both the equipping solutions that we feel that we need inside of our formations and also how to reorganize a brigade combat team to better prepare us for the future. And so we've been very rapidly pursuing that effort over here on this deployment. And we just finished up last month our culminating exercise, which was a combat training center rotation up in Germany at the Joint Multinational Readiness Center. And the outcomes and lessons from our deployment and that exercise were provided back to the Army and are helping to shape some of the decisions that Army senior leaders are making right now about what the future of the Army will look like.
I know you're wrapping up this particular deployment, and I'm sure there's going to be a whole post-mortem analysis of everything you did and everything you learned. But top of mind, what are some of the key takeaways that kind of make this deployment or this rotation different than previous ones?
Well, what's unique about our experience is that the Army has 3 Transformation and Contact 1.0 brigades. So this is really the first round of TIC, as we call it in the Army. And so we were the 3rd of the 3 brigades to go through that transformation. And while the other 2 occurred both at in CONUS with 2nd Brigade of the 101st and in Hawaii with 2nd Brigade of the 25th ID, we were the first unit to do this on an operational deployment. So what that meant is we had to do this in conjunction with the deployment mission that we were conducting over here, which was largely to integrate, partner, and train alongside of our NATO allies. So there were tremendous opportunities that were provided doing this deployed. We had the opportunity to immerse with our NATO allies who we train with and very quickly show them how we were incorporating a lot of these new technologies into our formations. And there's, in fact, a lot of interest amongst our allies in doing the same thing themselves because, you know, we're 90 miles from Ukraine right now. And so we're paying very close attention to what's happening in Ukraine, really trying to garner the lessons learned from that conflict, as are our NATO allies. And so everybody's looking at how do we become more lethal? How do we become more mobile? How do we become more ready for the future? And so to be able to do it really immersed in a deployed environment is something that has enabled us to move very rapidly with this effort. And we've made quite a bit of progress over the course of our time here in Europe.
So the war on Ukraine, I think, has become synonymous with drone warfare. So can you talk a little bit about how drones are being incorporated in your training, and then maybe some of the other technologies that you were experimenting with?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, as we're watching the war in Ukraine very closely, what we're seeing is one of the biggest changes to the battlefield today is how the rapid proliferation of drones is really being coupled with indirect fires and precision strike capabilities. So, you know, now rather than the traditional way of having a forward observer move across the battlefield to kind of get eyes and identify a target and call for fire, what we're seeing is the mass use of drones to rapidly fly around the battlefield and to get eyes on those targets and to enable a call for fire, which is very, very different from how we've done it in the past, where it's primarily done through manned observers. And so what a lot of these UAS provide is the ability to do that in mass, to find a lot of targets, to observe fire missions, and to enable indirect fires with a high degree of accuracy. And so, you know, if a human being is moving to a position to get eyes on an enemy and to call for fire, you're putting that person at risk. But with a drone, you can do this, in fact, actually probably finding targets with a higher degree of effectiveness than you can with a manned observer. You can actually observe a target with a higher degree of accuracy than a human being. And if it gets shot down, you've lost a machine, you haven't lost a human life. So we tried to replicate some of this at our Joint Multinational Readiness Center rotation that we conducted up in Germany. And the Army fielded us a very high density of drones on this deployment to get us ready for this exercise, to really test this out. We had over 150 of them going into the rotation. And as we fought as a new transformed brigade for the Army, 90% of the fire missions that we directed were all called and observed by a drone. Of course, very different from how we've operated under sort of the legacy model. So that's a big change there. That's allowing us to really kind of saturate the battlefield with sensors. You know, we have been talking about a transparent battlefield for a couple of years now in the U.S. Army. And what we saw through our experience is that we were really able to do that to the OP4, where we actually had more targets identified than we had the capability to deliver effects against it. And so as we employ drones in our formations, we're learning a lot about how to use them effectively and how to really make contact with unmanned sensors before we put a human being at risk. And we think that that's going to be paramount on the future battlefield. And so that was one of the ways in which we were employing new technology and trying to help the Army figure out the best way to equip ourselves, the best way to organize our formation, and the best way ultimately to fight with it.
You said something really interesting that the drones basically help you find more targets than you could actually do anything with. So I guess, what are you doing with that intel? Because I can imagine that just even having that data could be valuable, if not, right in the moment for later.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's all about understanding the enemy that you're facing. So, traditional reconnaissance, as we've done it throughout most of my career, is vital to being able to understand what the enemy is attempting to do to you. Putting scouts to a position where you can identify, is the enemy going left or is he going right? Is he weighting his main effort in the north or in the south? Because ultimately what that allows us to do is to prioritize our own resources against that. And so doing it with drones enables us to get a much greater picture of what the enemy is attempting to do, which then provides reaction time for us. What it also allows us to do is to attrit the enemy at depth in ways that we necessarily haven't been able to do before. So in addition to drones to spot targets, we also fielded and employed loitering munitions. And so, a loitering munition launches similar to a mortar round will come out of a tube, but then an operator has the ability to take control of it and to direct it with precision to strike a target and to destroy it. And so for us, over the course of our JMRC rotation that we conducted at the training center, we were able to kill over 50 enemy armored targets in that using simulated loitering munition strikes. And so we found them to be incredibly effective. And most of this was done several kilometers forward of our forward line of troops where our lead positions were. So we're able to reach out and affect the enemy at far greater ranges than we've been able to do in the past.
Since we're talking about loitering munitions, it makes me think of, GPS and vulnerabilities that come with that and the very real reality of electronic warfare and jamming. How is that factoring into your exercises?
We are paying a lot of attention to how the electromagnetic environment is being impacted in Ukraine. And one of the things that anyone who studies that conflict closely sees is that it's changing very rapidly. So drones that might work well one week might not even be able to fly the next week because really the EW atmosphere is iterating at such a fast pace that it reminds me of kind of similar to what things were like earlier in my career when we faced the problem of IEDs. And so when the Taliban in Afghanistan, for example, would employ IEDs, one of the first ways that they did that is they used a command wire to detonate the IEDs. And once we learned that they were doing that, we adapted our TTPs and we would dismount soldiers and we would cut the wire to prevent them from detonating that. After we did that for a short while, they then used a radio signal to detonate the IEDs. We caught on to that. We started jamming the radio signal. Then after, that was successful for us, we started seeing pressure plates on the road where now you would just drive over the pressure plate and it would detonate the IED. You didn't have the ability to cut a wire or to jam the signal. So it sort of went back and forth like that. After we recognized that the pressure plates were a risk, we put mine rollers on the front of our tanks. And so we would hit the pressure plate with the mine roller. And after we did that for a while, they started offsetting the pressure plates. So my point is that in warfare throughout history, there's always actions and counteractions. And that has been true throughout history. But what seems to be happening today, because technology is evolving so rapidly, that these cycles of action and counteraction are occurring on a weekly or even a daily basis. And that probably isn't happening anywhere faster than electronic warfare. So it is something that we as an Army are trying to adapt to as well, to learn more about, to employ more electronic warfare systems down at the brigade level and below. We employed these during our JMRC rotation, where we had electronic warfare teams that were out detecting the enemy. And we also use electronic warfare to help deceive the OPFOR that we fought against. So one of the important efforts that we conducted during the exercise was a deception effort where we placed electromagnetic emitters that would project a signal that we knew the enemy was looking for with their EW equipment. And we placed these adjacent to inflatable artillery cannons. And so the idea there was, rather than be able to target our real artillery that were hidden quite well, we had decoys that were offset. And as the enemy detected those signals, they then were able to confirm the presence with either a drone or a ground scout. And on 3 occasions over the course of our rotation, they actually fired at our decoys. And this is, of course, what we wanted to happen. So we had our radars in the position to detect their rounds and immediately counterfired, destroying their real artillery. So that was one thing we did in our rotation, but it's an example of what's happening out there on the battlefield today in Ukraine and in other places where electronic warfare is becoming a very critical part of the battle.
No, that's really fascinating, especially because I know that the Army particular, I know across the force, but definitely with the Army, like being able to control those digital emissions, those electronic emissions is definitely key to gaining an advantage. And just, I guess, from a physical or physics standpoint, I'm curious how the weather impacts some of these efforts that you're doing. Like, you're in a different climate over there in Romania or in Germany versus like down in Louisiana in the middle of the summer.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, it was, I believe, a deliberate decision by the Army to pick 3 brigades for their transformation and contact rotations at different parts of the world. JRTC for 2-1-1, out in Hawaii for 2nd to the 25th, and then us in Germany in the wintertime. So we saw some very significant weather impacts to our ability to fight and employ a lot of this technology. There were times where we were limited in our ability to fly our drones due to very low cloud cover or freezing fog that would descend into the tops of the hills there in Germany, which led to icing on our rotors. In fact, we actually crashed a couple of drones during the rotation because we really wanted to push the limits of their employment and to test them out and to see how aggressive we could be with them. So that was really all part of what the Army was asking us to do, is to see how effective we can employ these capabilities in those conditions. We also found that the battery life of many of our systems was significantly reduced in the cold. Drones that had flight times of around 40 minutes, for example, when we first fielded them in the summertime here in Europe and trained with them in warmer conditions, they only achieved less than half of that in the freezing temperatures up in Germany. So we saw the necessity, and one of the things we took from this was the requirement to have more power generation forward, as all this new technology is powered by batteries, and all batteries generally get sapped more in the cold. So we experimented with some very small generators that can be employed forward with platoons, generators that are quiet, as well as some power generation that was built into some of our mobility platforms. And that was one of our big recommendations back to the Army, is that as we field additional vehicles and other mobility platforms, building on-board power generation is critical, because every time a drone comes out of the sky, the first thing you need to do is to pull those batteries off and get them on a charger so you can get the drone back up. We also learned a little bit about how kind of the semi-mountainous terrain impacted our ability to fly drones at great distances. So the connection between the drone and the operators would become blocked by terrain, and that would limit the range that we could fly, which was different from our planning factors. So we had to either alter our plan as to where we wanted to fly the drones, or we had to reposition our teams to different pieces of terrain, up to higher ground, for example, so we could extend the range. But then that of course, adds increased risk of survivability for our drone operators. So as we continue to look at equipping solutions to enable the employment of a high density of drones like we were equipped with, we think it's really important to think about ways to enhance that signal so we can maintain communication with the drones. Things like employing a mesh network, in the sky that will enable all the signals to be repeated by one another and allow you to kind of extend the range of the network. So those are some of the impacts and things that we learned and passed back to the Army about the weather and environment that we trained in.
I do want to pick up on the network, but before we go there, I'm curious about the mobility aspect, because part of TIC is experimenting with formation. So from your perspective, your vantage point, how did that go, especially when you're talking about moving soldiers versus moving equipment and moving both?
Yeah, enhanced mobility is a necessity for infantry formations on today's, battlefield. Large static formations that are slow, they're not very mobile, they can be detected very easily, and they're at risk of being targeted by enemy long-range fires, spotted by drones, destroyed with loitering munitions. So the infantry has got to find ways to get more mobile. And actually, if you look at wars over history, battles are generally not fought on terrain that's the size of what we usually trained in, like a combat training center in a box, for example. They generally occur over much larger distances, much larger swaths of land. And so, to move troops around, you can either go through the air in planes or helicopters, or you can move over the ground. And so the main capability that we had to move troops was with the infantry squad vehicle, and a number of units across the Army have these now. But what that provides infantry formations with now is a very simple vehicle that allows us to rapidly reposition forces around the battlefield. And that's just absolutely critical to surviving. We use the term transparent to describe today's battlefield, meaning you can always be seen. So you need the ability to move quickly with organic mobility platforms rather than having to wait, for example, on some transportation unit to come and pick you up and move you. That's not really going to be conducive to be able to fight effectively in the future. So the infantry squad vehicle is not a fighting vehicle. It's not something that we're looking to mount a bunch of weapons or radios or other things to. The idea is just to have something where you can move big distances rapidly and dismount the vehicle to get off of it before you're in a position where you're expecting to make contact again with the enemy, and then dismount and then fight as a light infantry formation. So that's really the big thing that we're trying to get to with mobility. Now, we had some other capabilities. We had a platform called the SMET, which is an 8-wheeled robotic transport vehicle. And that's controlled by a remote that a soldier who's walking with the platoon can drive. And we use those to bring a lot of classes of supply forward further to the front lines, and to do it through the restricted terrain that the dismounted infantry were operating in. So rather than having to wait for a supply truck that generally is tied to a road to come forward and to drop off things like extra water or obstacle material, wire, or ammunition, we've got these robotic platforms that can start to bring some of the stuff with the platoon so they have it on hand with them. And these vehicles can move through some pretty significant terrain as well. So those are some of the ways that we used kind of enhanced mobility platforms to help kind of transition what we are historically as a light brigade, that walks primarily everywhere, to now having these mobility platforms that can help us maneuver around much more rapidly.
I do want to pivot to the network, because that's very key. It's something that the Army has been working on for a while, and you got some new kit there. Can you talk a bit about your experiences with the network and any challenges you might have had?
Yeah, absolutely, Lawrence. A couple big takeaways from our experience here. The first is that the use of the low Earth orbit satellite communications, so Star Shield, which is the DoD version of Starlink, is making a big difference. So today, we need the ability to send a lot of data across the battlefield. And that data might be something like a situation report describing a unit's current actions. That's a very small amount of data. The data might be something like a file or a Word document, an Excel spreadsheet that outlines an upcoming operation that the unit will do. So that's a larger amount of data. That data might be something like a collaborative meeting, like we're doing right now, where we can have a conversation, we can share our video screens, like when we do a commander's update brief, for example, with all the supporting units. You can imagine that's a lot more data. Or with really where we're going, that data might be several dozen, full motion video drone feeds that are being pushed back into an AI-enabled computer vision algorithm. That requires a tremendous amount of data. So to do the things that we are trying to get to on the battlefield, we have to have the ability to move the data around very rapidly from really out on the edge back into command posts so leaders can make decisions. So I think the problem of how do you transport large amounts of data across the battlefield without making yourself vulnerable to enemy electromagnetic detection is a really important question. And kind of conventional radios aren't going to be able to push that quantity of data. So using the low Earth orbit transport, we're finding to be very, very effective. The second piece is having a common operating picture that's shared across all warfighting functions using standardized data. So the integrated tactical network, which is what we fielded as part of our transformation contact, that's a C2 fix architecture. That's a great step forward to improving our communications in the near term. But what the ITN ultimately does is it just federates a bunch of disparate radios, devices, software programs together. And the shortcoming of federation is that it requires a need for a lot of troubleshooting and tech support. Because what we found is, if there's a bug somewhere in the network and you fix that, oftentimes that creates unintended problems in other parts of the network. So what we need in the future is a system that's designed from the very beginning to be integrated across all of its components. And this technology actually already exists. Most people use this in their everyday life, right? Where you can perform an activity on a phone or a tablet or a computer on a common application, and all of that is interoperable because the data is shared through the cloud. So this is where the Army is moving next. There's a lot of effort out there to develop the next generation command and control network. It's critically important. That's why the Army has placed such a high priority on the network. So, our experience, I think, is an incremental improvement, and we can communicate vastly greater than we could 9 months ago before we fielded all this equipment. But I think the Army recognizes that we need to go to the next step even faster, and that's the ability to integrate all these warfighting functions on the one common C2 platform, so we can do other things like shrink the size of our command posts, for example, or not to have so many devices that are operating their own discrete system. And there's a ton of benefits that will come from that. It'll make us more survivable. We can operate more dispersed. So it's just a critical effort. And, the Army is doing a lot of work right now to move forward with that. And it's pretty exciting.
We're talking about connectivity, but one of the things that I think about a lot, but also comes up in conversation is while, pushing data to the edge and making sure that it can be used tactically and, as close to real time as possible, obviously without putting troops in harm's way. Well, you want to do that. There's also the need to be able to kind of go analog and not have to rely on connectivity. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you're doing that?
Well, yeah. So I think there's a baseline assumption that's built into our training, and that is that at some point in the next fight, it's quite possible that none of the new technology will work as intended. It's because we know that adversaries around the world have very capable capabilities that can jam and disable our communications. So, as long as I've been in the Army, we've always had the global positioning system, GPS, that everyone's familiar with. But the first way the Army ever taught me how to navigate was with a map and a compass. Our drone operators who are flying our drones during our exercise were incredibly valuable to us because the drones provided such a great capability. based on what they were able to achieve. But to stay alive, they had to operate from camouflage positions. They had to exercise good noise and light discipline. We need to have personnel that were constantly conducting security. So the basic fundamentals are actually the foundation of everything we do, and we can't forget that. So, as a TIC unit who's fielding the most cutting edge technology that the Army has right now, we know that we can't get fixated on that, even though, that's kind of the main effort of what we're trying to advance for the Army. But it can't happen at the expense of the basics, because the basics are what keep people alive in combat. That's a very important message we continue to share with our leaders. And we have a warfighting philosophy in the Army called Mission Command, which is predicated upon, having to make decisions in the absence of being able to communicate with your higher headquarters based upon an understanding of the commander's intent and what you're supposed to achieve. So, that's sort of what we always fall back to. We want to use this technology and have it all networked together in the best situational awareness we can possibly achieve. But we also know that there's an incredible fog in war, and that's something that requires us to fight through. So being able to do the basic things well is really important to surviving and to succeeding in warfare.
In our last couple of minutes, I want to ask what's next. I know you're coming towards the end of your rotation, and then also ask if there's anything on your wish list to kind of experiment with the next time around.
Well, with respect to the wish list, the TIC has the Army moving out incredibly quickly with a lot of new technologies. I'd say in terms of the priorities of areas that we want to move even faster, we talked a lot about electronic warfare. We also need to advance our counter UAS capabilities quicker as well. So that's really important. On counter UAS, we were able to employ a couple of systems with good effects during our training. One was a handheld, kind of a non-kinetic counter drone system that breaks the signals between a drone and an operator. We found that to be relatively effective. The second system we had was larger system we mounted onto an ISV, and then actually automatically will detect group 1 and 2 UAS, and then we'll automatically jam them. But it's more of these types of systems that we need to get out to the force at scale moving forward, because when the next fight happens, drones are going to be a big part of it. So there's a lot of effort right now in development happening in the counter UAS space, and that's something where we want to be a part of that moving forward. I think with respect to what's next for the brigade, as we wrap up our deployment here, we go back to home station. For us, the important task is to be able to retain the proficiency that we've developed over here with these new capabilities. As the Army makes some decisions over the coming months about what the reorganization of brigade combat teams is going to look like, it will also encompass putting special skill sets at different levels than they may have been previously. So right now in a brigade, your drones were generally, back when we had the Shadow, was operated at the brigade level. But now we push so many of these capabilities down the lower levels, we need to start looking at military occupational specialties like drone operators and figuring out, how many do we need at different echelons. So there's a lot of important work and analysis going into that right now. And we'll certainly be able to help contribute to the conversation and make recommendations based off what we learned over here on our deployment.
Colonel, thank you so much. I have more questions for you, but that is all the time we have today. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lauren. It's been great to talk to you.
Up next, my colleague Megan Myers will lead our final discussion for Defense One. I'm Lauren Williams. Thank you for joining us.
We are really at the tip of the spear when it comes to developing new capabilities for our airmen and guardians. My name is Dan Berrigan. I work at the Air Force Research Laboratory, and I lead our efforts in worldwide research collaboration. The Air Force Research Laboratory is the Air Force's incubator for new technology. There is a dramatic shift and urgency to how we as a country stay at the top of our technological capability game. We're able to explore adopting generative AI tools to streamline elements of their job. We have PhD researchers that have gone to the best schools in this country, working on quantum sciences, working on bioinformatics, filling out long-winded pieces of paperwork, and these tools are speeding up that element to keep their focus on what the country and what our organization is counting on them to deliver. What typically has been done is a researcher, if they were building a web application, they build it on site with a server. With tools like App Engine and other serverless technologies, that gives our researchers a tool to focus on the project and less on the administrivia, keeping the operating system updated. And on top of that, the cost of these services are now pooled, right, and less expensive overall. These tools are enabling the ability to unlock the scale, to go from 5 users to 5,000 in a minute, in 10 minutes. You can pilot, prototype, and turn it on for everybody in our organization in less than a day. Now it's incredibly easy. As a research organization, it's our duty to be at the bleeding edge and adopt new technology. One of the unique advantages of Google Cloud is Google did not create its own building for government cloud. It leveled up its entire commercial cloud to meet compliance regulations for the federal and DoD government. That opens up a world of possibilities for our scientists, engineers, and partners to do things that were not possible if you did things on site. We utilize Google Workspace within Google Cloud Platform, all of it from Kubernetes to Compute Engine to storage to App Engine, Cloud Run, Cloud Workstations, Cloud Build. For researchers, it's like I dumped out all the Lego bricks and just said go. Like, you get to build whatever the heck you want. And these people are creative and they're brilliant, and they'll build the Millennium Falcon. The world is their oyster when you can finally just give them those Lego bricks. These tools are fundamentally accelerating our ability to iterate, try a new idea, iterate again, and focus on what matters.
Thank you, Lauren. That was a great conversation. Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning into today's State of Defense program, State of the Army. If you're just joining us, I'm Megan Myers, land warfare reporter at Defense One, and I'm thrilled to continue the discussion. I'm joined today by Dr. Richard D. Hooker, Jr. to talk about Army Futures Command and the effect it's had on Army modernization since it stood up in 2018. Rich is a senior associate at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center, non-resident senior fellow at the Transatlantic Security Initiative in the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and the Theodore Roosevelt Chair in National Security Affairs at the National Defense University. But before all of that, he graduated from the United States Military Academy in 1981 and served combat tours in Grenada, Somalia, Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, and that included a command of a brigade in Baghdad over 30 years in uniform. His military service also included tours in the offices of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Secretary of the Army, the Chief of Staff of the Army, and 3 National Security Council stints. So Rich knows what he's talking about. So this conversation between Rich and I got started a few months ago when he wrote an op-ed for Defense One about the Army being too top-heavy, specifically having too many 3- and 4-star generals. It turns out that the Army has been doing some trimming of that general officer count, which I wrote about in December. But one specific 4-star command had caught Rich's attention, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Army Futures Command, which stood up in Austin, Texas in 2018. Unfortunately, a representative from Futures Command could not be here today, but we will do our best to consider all viewpoints for and against. So, Rich, back in the beginning, what was Futures Command's mandate?
Well, I think General Milley's original idea, General Milley was the Army Chief of Staff at the time who stood up Army Futures Command. I think his original thinking was to try to create an organization that could get its arms around the many different Army acquisition programs, activities, facilities, and so on. It was quite an extensive list. And I think the idea was to try to establish some kind of unity of command over that effort to improve the performance of the Army acquisition process, which obviously it had any number of challenges going all the way back to the late 1980s, 1990s.
And so how was it set up and how is it different from any other Army acquisitions office?
Well, the Army Acquisition Corps, which is a sort of a single track career field of uniformed acquisition specialists, was created, I believe, in the late 80s, early 1990s. And the idea was to professionalize this effort and to improve performance across the board in bringing new programs onto line. Army Futures Command, I think, was intended to address some of the shortcomings that we're seeing in that process. I think it's interesting to note that none of the other services have a comparable organization. And the idea, I think, was to put some muscle and some seniority behind it. I think baked into the idea, though, was a sort of an inherent tension between the larger Army acquisition workforce, which is some 32,000 military and civilian, and Futures Command, which is about 17,000. And also some tensions were created between the civilian leadership, its roles and responsibilities over Army acquisition, and then the uniformed leaderships. That's become evident as the organization has grown and continued on.
So it can be good that it's not all career acquisitions officers because there can be people who have more recent hands-on experience. But at the same time, you and I had talked about it's not necessarily a job that someone who comes from an operational background really wants to be, spending a few years doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think you obviously you do want to have recent experience from the field Army informing these major acquisition decisions for sure. How a detour, a 2 or 3 year tour in Futures Command works out with an already tightly packed career timeline for sort of line officers is an interesting question. And I think the jury is still out on that.
So there are a couple of issues, and that goes into it. The idea that you need to staff this big command. It's a 4-star command, which means you got to have basically thousands of people in it
Right.
to fully staff it. So what does that look like in Futures Command, and what kind of staffing load does it create?
Well, I think there's a ripple effect that goes all the way down to tactical units in the Army. I mean, there are not a lot of 4-star commands in the U.S. Army, and obviously all of them are powerful and influential. The list of activities under Futures Command is quite extensive. If you'll allow me, just a partial list includes the Joint Modernization Command, the Combat Capabilities Development Command, Medical Research and Development Command, Futures and Concepts Center, Research and Analysis Center, the Army Applications Lab, the Army Intelligence Integration Center, Test and Evaluation Command, the Army Research Laboratory. There are some eight cross-functional teams, and believe it or not, a total of 14 Army battle labs. And I'm sure I've left some out. So it's a massive, it's a massive operation with a very large overhead. And I think the central question in this discussion is, have we seen progress and have we seen performance out of all of this since 2018?
Right. So that is my next question. Has Army Futures Command really revolutionized and, organizationalized the way that the Army does acquisitions and modernization? And what have been the deliverables out of it?
Right. Well, to be fair, it's tough sledding for any military organization acquisition organization to try to cope with really a bewildering set of legislative requirements, bureaucratic requirements, et cetera, solving all of that in the space of let's call it 8 years, would be a challenge. To be fair, I'm not aware that there's been significant reform in the legislative acquisition world. I think that probably was something that you could reasonably expect Futures Command to take on and to address. I don't think we're seeing a speed up in the time cycle of all the way from establishing requirements to fielding a system. I don't think we've really seen a speed up in that process, at least not that I can see. The list of major acquisitions that have been canceled is long and extensive and runs into the tens and tens of billions of dollars. So I think a damning indictment is that really of the system as a whole, not just Futures Command, is that the Army really hasn't successfully fielded a major combat system since the Big Five in the 1980s, the Abrams tank, the Bradley, the MLRS, the Patriot, and so on, the Comanche the Black Hawk and Apache helicopters. We really haven't seen any big successes since then. What we've seen is any number of sort of spectacular failures. Crusader, the Future Combat System, Comanche, and any number of other major programs have all in the end failed after heavy investment. So I think it's a fair critique to say the promise at least has not yet been realized.
So what went well with the Abrams, with some of those successful programs? How did they do it right? And is it possible in this current Army to do it right?
Well, I'm not sure I can answer the second one because people that are a lot smarter than I am, have wrestled with that. And so far it's still in the offing. It's still in the offing. Why was Abrams so successful? I think one reason was the project manager that was sort of put in charge to lead the effort was a very successful armor brigade commander. So he had long and detailed hands-on experience with the main battle tank. Obviously, he was assisted by any number of qualified civilians and military officers whose secondary specialty or functional area, of course, was acquisition. In the old days, up through the 1980s, early 90s, line officers, when they were not serving with troops, carried a functional area or secondary specialty. And they were experienced and qualified in those areas as well. It could be a comptroller, it could be a foreign area officer, it could be an acquisition officer. And then this process sort of reported to the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology. And I think it was a flatter, leaner, simpler system. I think you can't argue that the Abrams has been a tremendous success in various upgrades. It's still on the battlefield and arguably the most successful main battle tank in the world today. So I think there's a lot to be said for the way we used to do it. And I think the way we do it now is certainly open to critique and criticism.
The other thing I wanted to say about Futures Command is that it's a little bit sclerotic, right? Like their main priorities when they first launched were, and I have the list here, they call them cross-functional teams.
Right.
And there's long-range precision fires, next-generation combat vehicles, future vertical lift, air and missile defense, the network, and soldier lethality. And some of those have a little bit more room, or a bigger umbrella than others. But I would think after so many years into Futures Command, there might be time for some reflection about, are these our highest priorities still? Are these the buckets we want to put everything into, or is there something new? Is there something we can take away?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. If you look at the Army modernization priorities that were laid out in 2017 and 18, and you look at those same priorities in 2025, they're virtually identical. And that's interesting because we have this incredible laboratory right in front of us, the conflict ongoing in Ukraine, which I think is really charting the pathway for future conflict in the near term and in the midterm. And here are just a few examples. We obviously the most influential or the most impressive has to be the advent of drone and counter drone warfare. It's really amazing and remarkable what's going on, really on both sides. The Ukrainians, for example, will lose about 10,000, mostly commercially sourced drones in a month, and they'll just put up another 10,000. And they've got everything from very long range, large drones with large payloads that can strike deep into Russia, down to almost handheld drones, which are operated by individual soldiers that can be armed and used against even individual Russian soldiers. And Russia, you know, is really not behind the Ukrainians. They've gotten onto this sort of evolution in a very impressive way. In contrast, we talk a lot about drone warfare, and I think there's a lot of motion. But 3 years into this conflict now, we've really put very little in the hands of our soldiers if they had to go to war tomorrow. And I think this is a glaring vulnerability and a real worry. Other examples are air defense and electronic war. It may surprise our listeners that U.S. Army brigades and divisions have no air defense units and no electronic warfare units. Although we've been talking about returning to full spectrum operations and multi-domain operations and major theater war since at least 2014, even before Features Command was stood up. So clearly, sclerotic is a good word. We don't seem to have the ability to identify a pressing requirement, attack it, go off the shelf if we need to, and get it into the hands of the warfighters in a timely manner. And I think that's a real worry.
And if I recall correctly, that was kind of the idea behind Futures Command, is that you would have this massive machine that would be so good at modernizing that if you had a need like that, that you could whip something up more quickly than the Army had in the past. And what has kind of turned out is that rather than Futures Command kind of being at the head of this drone counter drone warfare project, the Army does have has put a lot behind that, but that's more on their transformation and contact signature project, which is which is separate from Futures Command.
Right.
And I understand there's some coordination that they do, but not really. And in that situation, they've got, troops in the field, they've got engineers and developers down there with them, helping tweak things, trying out prototypes, saying, no, we need it to do this, sending it back to the lab, doing a quick turnaround. But you don't really hear much about Futures Command being able to do that sort of quick maneuvering, despite it kind of being what Futures Command was built for.
Right, I think that's fair. And first of all, there's always going to be a significant amount of bureaucratic infighting whenever you create large organizations whose charter, to some extent, conflicts with other existing organizations. And there's been back and forth, no doubt about it. In 2022, Secretary of the Army Wormuth sort of stripped away some of Future Command's responsibilities and returned them to the civilian-led acquisition workforce. So this give and take, or this pulling and hauling, I think is inherent in large bureaucracies, no doubt about it. But as I understand it, the original idea was to cut through those realities to speed up the process. It's interesting to compare this approach, I would suggest, with the private sector, which more and more has gone to flatter and leaner as a way to improve performance, not only in the sort of end product, but also in the speed and the flexibility and the ability to innovate, which are understood to be necessary for this sort of progress. I'm not sure that creating other enormous organizations is the best way to solve that particular problem.
Although that is kind of a very Army way of thinking, that if you want to legitimize something, if you want to put the full weight and the full funding behind it, you put a 4-star at the top, and you have this ambitious undertaking. But it doesn't seem as though this ambitious undertaking has done much more for Army acquisition than the system that they had before. And as you mentioned, the previous Secretary of the Army actually took something out from underneath Futures Command and said, you know, someone else can do it better.
Yeah, I mean, you know, in the 1950s, C. Northcote Parkinson wrote a very famous book, which began as he observed that the British Royal Navy, as it got smaller and smaller after World War II, increased the number of admirals more and more and more. And he began to study that, and he saw it in many organizations, military organizations, but also civilian organizations. It seems to be almost an iron rule. So there has been a true explosion in the number of general and flag officer billets following 9/11. The numbers are really incredible. I don't have them in front of me, but they are really incredible. And as the services have drawn down and gotten smaller following the end of the GWAT, the number of general and flag officer billets has gotten larger and larger and larger. So fair enough, but then we have to ask, have we seen performance improve as a result of this more top-heavy sort of manning of the force? And I think the answer to that's pretty clear. Large organizations find it difficult to turn on a dime. They find it more difficult to innovate. Staffs find themselves fighting with themselves as opposed to being sort of more command driven. How George Marshall managed in World War II is a very interesting question, because he took on enormous global responsibilities with far less than the U.S. Army has today, and managed to be pretty successful, I think. And another added argument is that the advent of automation beginning in the late 1980s was supposed to increase productivity and reduce manpower needs. Really hasn't worked out that way, has it?
Right. So given that it does take a long time, for instance, to make a new helicopter that's going to do all the things, for instance, that the Black Hawk does, or to create a long-range precision fires missile system, what have we seen come out of Futures Command? And also, what are some of the things that have been dropped along the way?
Well, I earlier gave you a partial list of canceled programs. I mentioned, I think, Crusader, Comanche, the Future Combat System, which was canceled in 2009, was almost a $20 billion program. The Comanche was followed by the Armed Reconnaissance Helicopter, which failed. That was followed by the Armed Aerial Scout, which also failed. FCS was followed by the Ground Combat Vehicle. That program, multi-billion-dollar program, that failed. Just last year, the Extended Range Cannon Artillery program was canceled after some very significant investments. And then a Future Attack Reconnaissance Aircraft, which I guess was the fourth follow-on to Comanche, was also canceled. And here's an interesting, I don't know if Futures Command would call it a success, but an interesting example is the M10 Booker, which is the sort of light tank, which is being fielded in light divisions, I think beginning this year. It's very interesting because it's much smaller, much lighter, much less well-armed than an Abrams tank, but it's actually more expensive. Much less capable, but significantly more expensive. The overall program cost, it depends on how you define it, and there are about 4 different definitions for program cost. But I think if all of the light divisions are equipped as envisioned, it would be north of some $7 billion. And that translates into 4 of these light tanks in an infantry battalion. And obviously, they're not capable of fighting main battle tanks. The Army explicitly says that. And 4 of these in an infantry battalion is not enough to move the needle. It's not enough to change anything. Now, are there other priorities that we could have spent those billions of dollars on? I would argue that drone, counter-drone, electronic warfare, and short-range air defense would seem to be much higher priorities, given the example of what we're seeing in Ukraine. And yet this took on a life of its own, and it's driving through to fielding. Not sure I understand the thinking behind it.
I mean, that's a really interesting point. I was just at a conference recently, and General Rainey, who is the commander of Futures Command, said we don't want to be spending lots of money on these sort of mid-range things. We want things that are exquisite and survivable and sustainable, and we will pay tons of money for them. And we'll have a few and they'll be perfect. Or we want, cheap disposable, as you mentioned, Ukraine with the drones, something we can buy in 10,000 packs. And when they blow it up, we can just buy more. And we want to stay out of that middle range of things that are really expensive, but don't do everything. And so it's interesting that they're now in this conundrum with this light tank that it is more expensive than what they were using and does less.
Yeah, now a sort of a bit of context here. I'm quite sure that there are some significant congressional supporters behind the Booker. No doubt about that. I mean, any four-star has to contend with those kinds of issues, no doubt about it. But I keep hearing that the Army leadership wants to move away from a few costly, exquisite systems, which may or may not even be survivable. The MQ-9 Reaper is a good example of an expensive, big body UAV that very likely won't be able to survive, on the modern battlefield. I keep hearing we want to move away from that construct and move to, the more and the cheaper and the disposable. I just don't see it happening.
Right. Well, it's like you mentioned, it's hard to do when there's money behind some of these things, but it is also, it's notable when their rhetoric is is in opposition to what is actually happening
Right.
in the program offices. So then the question is, if the Army were to rethink Futures Command, not necessarily wrap it up and throw it away, what could they do to tinker with it, aside from, of course, downgrade it, which I know that you're in favor of, into a smaller, a fewer star command?
Yeah, it's a great question. If I were given the job of trying to rethink the whole enterprise, I think I would go back to the last time we did it well and try to drill down into why that system seemed to work and then go forward from there. I think that's a good starting point. We had a system which, to all appearances, was successful and effective. It fielded the major combat systems that we still use today in upgraded variants. And I think there's a lot to be seen there. Look, there's no doubt that in this game, you're going to try a lot of things that are going to fail. I understand that. We toyed with dozens of combat aircraft in World War II that never saw the light of day, and many other systems as well. But we did it quickly. I think we went through 3, if not 4, major different variants of the main battle tank before we hit on the M4 Sherman, which was the standard, tank for World War II. And we did that in the space of about 3 years. So it can be done. If we need a firmer, stronger, better articulated partnership with industry and with the Congress, then let's get after that. The president does have authorities that he can use. The Defense Production Act is one of them, to try to get after this. A lot of it is just explaining the problem and asking for help. I think there are a lot of well-intentioned people in the U.S. Congress, in the executive branch, in the Army Secretariat, who want to solve these problems and understand the urgency of need. And I think Future Command is positioned to fight that fight and articulate those needs. But we've got to do better than we've been doing in the past. The agility and the innovation just do not seem to be there. And if you ask the young captains, as I often do, they will say, listen, an army in 2035 that's exquisite is great, but it doesn't make a lot of sense if we get defeated in 2026. We can't always be talking and funding programs which are going to be realized in the out years when we have real urgent needs right now. I think that's the real challenge.
Right. Also, so the Army undertook this big kind of star search to figure out where they were going to base Futures Command, and they landed on Austin specifically for, sort of the tech innovation environment there. The Army has at times tried to adopt a, fail fast, fail often, Silicon Valley sort of acquisitions philosophy. That it seemed to have really happened, that when things aren't working, they're still kind of puttering them along. So that's the first part of the question. But the other part of the question is, does it make sense, even, in the universe of maybe we downgrade this to a 2-star command, to bring it back to DC, where the people who are doing this work can be closer to the professional acquisition force in DC, but also maybe to some of these lawmakers to be able to make a better case for why things need to be canceled or rethought.
Yeah, I don't have inside information on why San Antonio was selected. Texas has got a very large and powerful congressional delegation. I think the location was seen to be kind of sexy. It's sort of an innovation hub.
Mhm.
But I think you're right. At the end of the day, the people who matter and the decisions are going to be taken, that's going to happen. That's going to happen in Washington, D.C. And that's going to be in the wheelhouse of the most senior Army leadership, military and civilian. I'm not sure I advocate downsizing Futures Command to 2 stars. I remain to be convinced that there's a real role or need for Futures Command altogether. I think we have an alternative model that was proven to be successful that we could perhaps go back to.
I mean, that's well said. So is there anything else that I didn't ask about that you want to make sure is part of this discussion?
No, I think this has been wide-ranging. I do want to say up front that I don't want to in any way traduce, the backgrounds, the contributions of all the people that are working in this enterprise. General Rainey and his predecessors were obviously very distinguished and successful general officers who devoted, many, many years in many, many different positions of high responsibility. I believe they're all doing the very best that they can in a difficult environment. I'm just not so sure that we're organizationally set up and equipped for success in a world that increasingly demands agility and rapidity and innovation, and moving sort of at the speed of need. We do have one example out there. I'm not a fan of how SOCOM, U.S. SOCOM, has ballooned. It's, by the way, larger than the Army staff, which is really interesting, since it has about 10% of the people that the Army has to take care of. But one area that I think you can point to with respect to SOCOM is that it's managed to cut through a lot of these barriers and obstacles, and it has an ability to field sort of off-the-shelf technology pretty quickly and pretty effectively and get it into the hands of our special operations folks much faster than the normal cycle seems to permit. So there may be some lessons to be gleaned from looking at how SOCOM operates or what authorities have been provided to U.S. SOCOM, and that might lead us down some more fruitful paths.
That's really interesting and also a great idea for a future panel. So thank you for bringing that up.
My pleasure. Great being with you today.
Yeah, thanks for being with us.
Okay.
The Department of Defense is supercharging cyber defense programs with Google, testing and improving systems, identifying vulnerabilities, and keeping vital systems secure. This is a new era of American innovation.
As we conclude the final installment of our State of Defense series, focusing on the state of the Army, I want to extend my sincere appreciation to all of you for joining us today. Your engagement and thoughtful participation are essential to these critical discussions. Keep an eye on your inbox. We'll be sending out the on-demand video link soon, so you can revisit today's key insights and share them with colleagues. We encourage you to continue the conversation by discussing and sharing the ideas explored today. The challenges and opportunities facing the Army and the broader defense community are ever evolving, and fostering ongoing dialogue is key to understanding and shaping the future. For Defense One, I'm Megan Myers. Thank you for being part of today's discussion.